Okay, welcome. It is June 6th, and so glad to be with you tonight. As you know, we are so lucky to be with Glenn Grossman, who is an epidemiologist with over 20 years of experience. While pursuing his doctorate in epidemiology at UNC Chapel Hill, Glenn served as an epidemiologist on staff at the UNC Infectious Disease Clinic for 2 years, and he taught epidemiology and advanced analytics at Duke Medical School and at UNC. He has been involved in epidemiology forecasting and advanced analytics with Bristol Myers Squibb, Sanofi, Novartis, Medicare, Medicaid, Veterans Health Administration, Military Health Service, the CDC, and other programs within the United States and abroad. All views expressed today are his own. So as usual, Glenn, if you could please give us an update on how things are looking with the COVID-19 pandemic, variants of concern, and vaccination here in the US and abroad, that would be a good place to begin.
Hey, Rebecca. Hey, everyone. Thanks for the introduction. All right, so let me share my screen. So we are past Memorial Day weekend now, so we are in the summer season. If not the official summer season, we're all experiencing it as summer, at least in the Northeast right now, where we've hit 90-degree days in the weekends. And so we're no longer in typical cold and flu season. And we've been finding that globally, COVID-19 has been following the typical cold and flu seasonality. So we're no longer in the season. So that means this is the best time of year to, if you've been vaccinated and you can get outdoors and enjoy your life, do it now. This is the best time to be doing it because we're not in cold and flu season. In fact, when we're looking at the screen here, this is the CDC's website, the COVID tracker on transmission. Yellow represents, it's not perfect. Some states have much lower, but yellow is fairly decent. We're a lot better off than we are now versus a few months ago. There's still a few states that, in fact, on this one, it's different than on some other sources that I'm looking at. One issue is that the testing rate has gone way down. This is good and bad. For an individual who's getting tested, it's likely that during a time period like this, when it's not cold, flu, and COVID season because it's summertime, during this time of year, the majority of tests that come back positive are actually going to be false positive tests. So for an individual getting a test, it's most likely going to be a false positive. So a lot of individuals are really not motivated to look at these test results or get tested. However, at a population level, epidemiologists can adjust based on our understanding of what percentage are likely to be a false positive, and then using that adjustment, look at the data to see whether there is an increase or decrease or leveling off of what we're looking at in terms of the COVID-19 spread. And the problem is that because a lot of people are not getting tested now, on the one hand, it's kind of a waste for these people to get tested if it's very likely, if there is a positive result, that it's a false positive. And from an epidemiologist perspective, Rebecca, can you mute the ethics? But from an epidemiologist perspective, it really leaves us in a bind, because one of the things that we're finding is that there are a few states where the COVID hospitalization rate is increasing. And so they give multiple tests to check to see if it's a false positive when they come in for COVID. And what we are finding is that in Arkansas, Montana, and Wyoming, there's more significant hospitalization increases, which is so weird. It's not cold and flu season. There has been this worry that when you look at the, do I have a picture? Well, when you look at where the United States has been, we're in the yellow now, I think. So US, that first wave that hit back in April, March of last year was followed by a summer wave in the South. And the summer wave wasn't as fatal. The infection fatality rate went down because it was tended to be younger people that were the ones getting sick. They were going outside, not wearing masks and stuff. And so, but we had this surge in the summer in the South. So a lot of eyes are looking now to see whether we'll have another surge in the next month or two. Again, in the South and in some of these areas, particularly in the unvaccinated areas. But it's interesting because there's, when you look at a bunch of the models that are out there, I'm going to just come down here real quickly. So this is showing a comparison of different groups that are modeling what the likely scenarios are. And it's interesting because most are reflecting the seasonality of the disease and are just assuming it's going to continue to drop through the end of summer. And then most of us are believing that it's going to start to rise in September, October, November, the typical cold flu season. However, some of the models are expecting that even though there's this big seasonality impact, they're expecting that we're going to see something similar to what we saw last year with the second surge, simply because of two reasons. One, people are not wearing masks as much anymore and physically distancing. And in a bunch of states in the South, the vaccination rate is not super high, particularly among the folks under age 65. And then the second reason is that now we have these new variants that we've been talking about that are spreading. And the new variants are 2 to 3 times as contagious as the old ones. In particular, and we'll get into it in a little while, what we've been calling this India variant, the B1617.2. Now I'll talk about that in a little while. We're starting to call that Delta now. The World Health Organization is trying to standardize the names that we call these things. And so this is that genomic variant is going to be called Delta going forward. So I'll be talking about Delta. But so what we see here is that there's uncertainty of what the next couple of months are going to look like. So going back into the United States, this is where we are with transmission. Here's where we are with cases. You see that there's variation. Some of these states have a higher caseload than others. Some states like California have come way down, which is great. But so right now all eyes are on the South. I mean, not just in the South, but these other states that are still a little bit high, as well as the ones that I mentioned, like Arkansas. It's not reflected here. Part of the reason is that, like I said, the testing rate. I discussed that. All right. So we have the death rate, and so it's pretty similar in terms of what we're looking at. There's some slight variation across states. A lot of that is due to the nursing homes that are still being infected versus not. We might talk about that a little bit later. All right. In terms of vaccination, so let's start here. So this is the percentage of the population with at least one dose over the age of 18. And you can see that there is some variation. So on the coast, they tend to be a little bit more vaccinated. In the middle of the country, particularly the South, with the exception of Florida, there's some big gaps. Wyoming is at a gap here too. When you look at the fully vaccinated, it's more apparent in terms of what the trends that we're looking at. The coast, the Northeast and the West Coast are clearly pretty well vaccinated in terms of fully vaccination. So for instance, New Jersey, we're looking at 63% fully vaccinated. When you look at the age over 65, New Jersey is at 80%, with over 80%, which is great. Wisconsin's even higher. And again, this is the fully vaccinated group. The reason why the distinction is so important is because before we were saying that one dose provides around 50% and the second 50% protection, and the second dose bumps it up to like 95%. The issue now with the variants is that with particularly this Delta variant that I just mentioned, a single dose, not the J&J vaccine, but a single dose of the mRNA vaccine only provides around 30% protection on average. And it's even worse potentially among people over the age of 65 and whatnot. So it's very poor protection. It's the second dose bumps it back up to closer to 80%, maybe a little bit over 80%, which is good. But that's a much larger difference between that in terms of the likelihood of getting infected. And so therefore, everyone needs to get their second dose. At this point, a lot of people have not gotten their second dose in the US, and so it's problematic. And so that's what we're looking at. Great. And this is over the age of 65. Again, they're the ones at highest risk. Obviously, we've talked about people with comorbidities being at high risk as well, and some other features. But generally, age 65 is one crude estimate of people who are at higher risk. And so that's why a lot of eyes are ensuring that the vaccination rate is higher there. All right, it's interesting. So even though we're no longer in the typical cold and flu season, this is looking at the last 4 weeks of the amount of COVID cases that are confirmed in each state. And you'll notice, and this is relative to normalized by the size of the state. And you'll notice that a bunch of states, like, so I mentioned Wyoming, the hospitalization is increasing, and the cases, even despite the testing, are still somewhat high, or not as high as we were a few months ago, but they're not falling down. Like I would have expected a much more rapid falling. So for instance, some of these other states down here, they were higher, and then now they're just continuing, like Connecticut is continuing to fall, continuing to fall. We're in the summer, but some of these others are now staying, like Colorado, the caseload is still too high, and they've sort of flattened off. And I don't know exactly what's causing that, but it could be some of these variants that we can get into in a second. In fact, now is a good time to switch to the variants. So here at a high level are the new names. I don't know if we can see this that well. So basically, the key variants we've been talking about before, the variants of concern. The first one was what we sometimes called the UK variant, which is B117. This was the one that we've talked about that was 50 to 70% more contagious than the original Wuhan version, and is around 50% or more severe than the original one. And so this one, the new name is just Alpha. And the reason Alpha, so Alpha in the Greek alphabet is the very first letter, and it's come into the English alphabet. That's where the word alpha as an alphabet comes from. And so that's the very first one. The reason it's now the first comparison for everything is because Alpha is everywhere now. It's so contagious that it's spread everywhere, and it's pretty much the most common variant everywhere at this point, for the most part, with some exceptions. However, Alpha is pretty well addressed by the vaccines. So in some countries that have more vaccinations, you would expect, well, maybe less B117. The problem is that it's so contagious that it's still able to get through the population, even if they have a high vaccination rate, because there's still a lot of unvaccinated people at risk. And even among the vaccinated, there's a small percentage that can still get infected, and so it's still getting through there. The next one is Beta. This was what we called the South Africa variant. This can penetrate the vaccines a little bit more, but it's not very contagious, or not contagious relative to the Alpha, let's say. And so as a result, it's not quite as common. P1, the same thing. It was previously called the Brazil. It was also in Japan. Now we're calling it Gamma. But Beta and Gamma are not nearly as common as Alpha. Delta is the one that's I'm most concerned about, both Alpha and Delta, but Delta I think is the one that's really going to hit us. So far, I think that's the one that's really going to hit us in October, November this coming year. It's still really early, and I've mentioned before that the variant that might strike us the hardest in the next fall winter season might not have even been widespread. It might not be spreading yet. It might not have even evolved and broken out yet. So that means come July or August, we'll need to see what's spreading, and we might have new variants that we'll be looking at. But right now, Delta is the one that a lot of us are looking at. We've discussed it a bunch of times previously, and I'll get into it a little bit more in just a minute or two. But I'll just go through some of these others. Zeta is another one in Brazil, another variant that's been spreading in Brazil. Eta is another variant in UK. Theta is in the Philippines that's been identified. Kappa, and I think Kappa, oh no, not Kappa's not the last. Kappa is another variant in India. And India has produced a bunch of different variants. I'm really not as concerned about 0.1, the B1617.1, 0.3, or just the original one. It's really 0.2 that just when I'm looking at the clinical features and looking at the epidemiologic data, that I find really the most concerning. Some of these other ones that they're just starting to look at, that they're monitoring, they're no longer looking at some of these other naming in terms of the places. Now we're calling Epsilon is B1427 and Iota is B1526. And I think both of these might have been in the United States where we started them. I think one of these is California, one of them is New York City. But anyway, these are what are being followed as well. All right, but the key ones that I'm looking at here are Alpha, and Delta. All right, so let's go to the next one. Unfortunately, the US, we're kind of slow here. So this is World Health Organization nomenclature. In the US, we are still using the old lineages. And this is the what we call the pangolin lineage. That's the nomenclature that's being used. And so I've been talking about this, that the B1617.2 has been increasing very rapidly. And so when you look at this, so for instance, the week ending or 2-week period ending May 8th, it was a roughly 1.3% of all the cases were this Delta. And now it's estimated that the week ending May 22nd, it's more than doubled to 2.8%. And the 2.8% is the national average. It's clearly spreading in some places much, much more aggressively. So for instance, the USA, this is B1617.2, 2.8% is USA as a whole. For Arkansas, Louisiana, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Texas, it's as high as 4.1%. In Iowa, Kansas, Missouri, and Nebraska, it's 4.5%. And in this bunch of states over here, including Arizona, California, Hawaii, Nevada, American Samoa, some of these others, that smaller territories, it's hit 4.7%. So 4.7% versus the national average of 2.8. And then most concerning so far is it has hit 6.8%. So roughly 7% in Colorado, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Utah, and Wyoming. So some of this growth in Wyoming, Montana, I think when the Colorado wasn't doing so great in some of the maps I was looking at, could be explained simply by some of the growth in the Delta. The B117, so this is the UK variant that's also called Alpha. You can see why this is such a big concern. It's roughly 73% in the US as a whole, and 82% in some places. It varies a lot. You can see that they don't vary in the same way. So for instance, B117, again, Alpha, is 82% in region 6, but region 9, it's 64%. So that's a pretty wide difference. It varies a lot in the United States, but pretty much across the board, just because it's so aggressive, it's so contagious, it's just overwhelming everything else. The interesting thing is that Delta is more contagious than that. So it's only a matter of time until it spreads. In fact, in the United Kingdom, where B117 was first identified, and B117 hit them really, really hard in December, January, that they had to lock down. It hit them really hard. Now, this Delta variant is hitting them even harder and is wiping out the spread of the original UK variant, and is now being replaced by the Delta variant in UK. So, so this is a serious thing that we're going to be looking here. Here are the regions, just at a glance. You see that the orange was the Alpha variant, the UK variant, and the purple. Here, I'll come back over here. Purple, dark purple. This one is the Delta. It's a little bit hard to see, but Delta is still pretty small in some places, but getting larger in other places. So what was this? I said it was region 8, where it was almost 8%. So it's visible on this that it's the purple here is the Delta. In other regions, it's a lot smaller. But it's coming across the United States. It's coming. All right, let me just look at the globe, and then we'll open up to questions. All right, let me see. Let me just see if there's anything else first in the US. Oh, so I talked about vaccinations, and I talked about cases. One other thing. Let's see, I think that's fine for now. All right, let me go into the globe. All right, so we've talked about this being the seasonality component to this, where it's basically following cold and flu season. And we were looking at this last year, and that was what made it most apparent to us. Because you recall that the southern hemisphere, it's reversed, and so they're currently in their cold and flu season. They're approaching their winter now. And so what you see is that clearly there's been a reversal. In the northern hemisphere, North America, Europe, Asia, our caseload has gone down dramatically. But now the southern hemisphere, Brazil was struggling for a while, but you can see that some of these states right now, or some of these countries, are doing quite poorly and getting worse. And so, or staying equally bad. And so this is, we're going to continue eyeing them for the next couple months to see, because I had mentioned that that this Delta variant, right? So we're still waiting for the terminology to flow through everywhere, but the Delta variant is in South America at this point. This isn't a great map of it, because right now what we're looking at is the total counts, and what I'm most interested in is, say, that the percentage counts over the last week or two would be ideal, but this is still a good proxy, because it's because wherever it hits, it tends to take over because it's so contagious. And so what you're looking at is a lot of UK there's a lot of the Delta there. United States has some. Surprisingly, Australia has some. I mean, it's the winter months and it's starting to spread there. Australia has generally been pretty good in terms of their keeping their caseload down. The problem is that they keep on locking down different areas, and that's problematic for a bunch of reasons long term. But in terms of where they are, that's the right now, this very contagious Delta variant is what's starting to spread there. In the southern hemisphere, it's there, but it's not the primary thing that's spreading right now, although there is a lot of gray, so a lot of missing data where we just don't know what's going on. But we know that this is so contagious that if it's not there yet, it will be there within the next couple of months. And so this is a natural experiment that what happens there in the next couple of months is what will happen to us in our winter. And the reason is, you might say, well, what about vaccinations? Here is the vaccination rate, the percentage of people who have gotten at least one dose of the COVID-19 vaccine. When you look at some countries like Chile, they're at 58%, approaching 59% vaccination with at least one dose. And Uruguay is at 56%. So here's Uruguay. Yet when you look over here at Uruguay, Uruguay is doing really, really, really poorly. So this vaccination, just as a source of comparison, the United States is only at 51%. So as well vaccinated as the US has become, we have less than Chile or Uruguay have. And so they tried to set themselves up for success for their current cold and flu season, their winter. But you look at Uruguay and they're doing really, really poorly. And so you look at Chile, they were doing more poor. They're still not doing great, but they're not doing nearly as bad as Uruguay. But again, a lot of this has to do with the variant. So we need to see how the variant spreads. Argentina is doing poorly. Brazil was doing really bad for a long time. Luckily, they're doing a little bit better now. So many people have gotten infected. So many people have gotten reinfected even after the first time. The vaccination rate is really low in Brazil. I mean, it's 23%. They've been slow on the uptake there, which is sad. It's the government response has been poor there. But so anyway, I like to use Uruguay and Chile as an example because they have been vaccinated, and so we should be seeing. We shouldn't be seeing what we're seeing there based on the story that we tell ourselves about how great these vaccines are. And the vaccines are amazing, but yet Uruguay is here where we are. They're generally not using the same distribution of vaccines, but pretty much all of the vaccines are quite effective. The mRNA vaccines are a little bit more effective, but I mean, when you look at the J&J vaccine, it's pretty similar to AstraZeneca. So it's surprising what we're seeing here. So again, through the summer here, we're going to continue to look at this map because this is what happens in their winter will very likely be what happens in our winter. All right, so this is what we're looking at in terms of cases. Was there anything else I wanted to talk about here? I think that this is it at a high level. I can just come back here for a second. So this is going back to the United States. Was there anything else I wanted to talk? So masks are going down. We still are going to have this one issue where because a lot of the CDC has not been performing perfectly over the last year and a half. And one of the things that they did was when they told us that we could take our masks off, they didn't communicate it as a pause. A lot of people think that we could take our masks off because the COVID epidemic is basically over, that we could almost throw away our masks. And I think a lot of people probably did throw away their masks. And they don't realize that in the fall and winter, we're probably going to have this surge come back. I did a poll among some epidemiologists on some of the volunteer groups that I'm with from around the country. And we did a poll on what people think will happen in the United States. And around half the people thought that we're going to have a surge with as many hospitalizations as last year. And around half thought we were going to have a surge, but it's mostly going to be a surge of cold symptoms with all the vaccinations and or asymptomatic. So it's going to be a lot of spread of the virus, but not severe disease where it's a lot of people are in the hospital and dying. It was around half and half. I'm more on the side right now, based on what we've been discussing, that I think we're going to be having more hospitalizations, particularly with this new variant, but it's still an open question. All right, Rebecca, let's open it up to questions.
Oh, goodness. Glenn, I was about to make a joke and now it doesn't feel appropriate.
I mean, it's up to you. We like humor.
Can you take us back to your slide where you showed us how the variants now have new names? Yes, that slide. So you showed us how they got these names, the B1, R2, D2, and when did they get those names? Around when did those names appear? Early on, we started getting these names, right?
Yeah, there's actually
B11.
There's this. So there's actually multiple lineage, multiple nomenclatures. So I think this is Pango. I don't even know what they all are. But there's a couple, there's like two main organizations. One is called the Pangolin Organization.
Okay.
And then there's another that does all the genomic research globally, just in general. And so those were the first two. And then a lot of people were lazy, and I'm frequently lazy, and we're just calling it the UK variant.
No, you're not.
But
no, it's okay.
But because we've now gotten some variants that are the key ones that we're following, we don't need all these names because they're just confusing to people.
It's
so that's
really
why we've shortened
confusing.
it.
So this is great. So because the B117 and all these B1612, it was like a bad horror movie. It just reminded R2D2. It was just really hard. I don't know about everyone else, but I was really having a hard time keeping track. But now, to be honest, good for the World Health Organization for just like kind of making it easier. But now, to be honest, it's really going to start feeling like a really, really bad fraternity party. With all this alpha, beta, and gamma coming together. So everyone hold on tight. I don't know about you, but I don't know where this is going to be going. So Glenn, just kind of parse it down for us and just like, let's see where this thing goes. Okay, let's move on. Questions, everyone. If you have them, send them to me via chat and I will do my best to work them into our conversation. Thank you to everybody who has sent in questions during the week. And a big question that has come in is herd immunity. We've talked about this a bunch over our time together, and it has been a goal. I know, the Biden administration has been talking about this 70%, the goal of getting to 70% of adults, or I guess those who are able to be vaccinated. I guess at this point it's 12 and over by 4th of July. Is that herd immunity? Are we going to achieve herd immunity in pockets of this country, across the country? What does it mean? And are we going to get there?
No, so I don't think any epidemiologist believes we can achieve herd immunity at this point. Herd immunity, if you recall, oh shoot, let me see if I can I should have brought this slide up. I'm not going to even search for it now. Herd immunity, if you recall, is this idea where if enough people get vaccinated and have immune protection from the virus, they can no longer spread the virus, then there's so many people that if there's an occasional person who's unvaccinated, that you have this herd immunity, this concept that it protects that individual or those few individuals from getting infected because you have so many people around them who cannot spread the virus. That's what the whole concept of herd immunity is. The original estimate for the herd immunity for this virus. So herd immunity is based, how you calculate it is based on how contagious a virus is. So for instance, a very, very contagious infection like measles requires a much higher number of people, a much larger percentage of people to get vaccinated in order to get herd immunity to protect them. Whereas in contrast, a less infectious virus might need a lower number of percentage, or lower percentage that's vaccinated in order to protect random people. The problem is that the original Wuhan variant of COVID-19 had an estimated transmission rate of 2 to 3. You remember the concept R naught? That was the original spread rate, was 2 to 3. So each person on average infected 2 to 3 others. We know that the majority of the spread was from super spreaders rather than individuals. And a large percentage of people actually spread it to no one at all. So the 2 to 3 was the average of the super spreader events and the others. So now the problem is that since then, the alpha variant, what we're calling the UK variant, this alpha variant has become much, much more common. And the alpha variant is 50 to 70% more contagious. And what that means is that the number of people that would need to be vaccinated would not be 70% anymore. It would need to be much higher than 70%. And now the other problem is the Delta variant. And the Delta variant is thought to be 50% more contagious than the Alpha variant. So here's Delta, here's Alpha. If you're 50% more contagious than the Alpha variant, then that means that the new R naught, and again, this R naught, this concept means this is what the spread would be if we had no masks, no vaccines, no social distancing, no precautions at all, if it were just spreading unrestrained. And under those situations, because that would be herd immunity, where this concept is we're totally back to normal, not adjusting our behavior in any way. The pandemic is over. And so that concept of herd immunity, in order to hit that, the new R naught, the average number of people that this would spread to, based on how contagious the new Delta variant is, puts it up near measles territory, which means 90 to 95% of all people in the United States, including kids under the age of 12, would need to have protective immunity. And protective immunity is different than having severe disease, because a lot of people, we know that there's two key aspects with the vaccine. One key aspect of the immune system is it prevents hospitalizations, it prevents severe disease. And frankly, that's the most important thing that a lot of us are caring about. That's why we're encouraging everyone to get vaccinated. But the other important thing is to prevent infection. If people get infected and it's asymptomatic, then that means they can still spread it to other people. Right now, the best estimate is that among people who are infected who have been vaccinated, the transmission rate is around 50% less than the unvaccinated transmission rate. But 50% less is still really high. So if you have 1 million people who are vaccinated who are infected, and 50% of them can spread it to other people, well, guess what? You have 500,000 people who are spreading it now. That's a lot. And so as a result, there's no way we can, with the current technology, with the current vaccination rate, there's no way we can get to enough people getting vaccinated that we are at truly herd immunity, where we stop the spread of the virus. So there will continue to be spread. It's just going to be that most people will not have severe disease if they're vaccinated, which is great news, but it means that the herd immunity is not possible. The key conclusion here then is that because there won't be herd immunity, there is nothing stopping the unvaccinated people from getting infected. Again, this herd immunity concept is that the unvaccinated would have this halo effect, this protection, because the herd is protecting them. But because this can't happen, our estimates are that pretty much every unvaccinated person in the United States and probably around the world will get COVID-19 within the next 2 to 3 years. It's just because the variants are super contagious. So there's not really any way to avoid it at this point. So that's why everyone needs to get vaccinated if they can. And if they can't, then looking at the monoclonal antibodies as prophylactic shots that might last for a few months at a time, and they're looking at these long-acting ones where you maybe get the shot once every 6 months or once a year. These would probably be a good alternative for people who can't get vaccinated. But that's where we are. Does that make sense? The herd immunity question?
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. Mark has a question about the variant percentages. Mark, if you could unmute and ask your question, that would be great.
Okay, just a clarification, please, Glenn. When you were first going over those percentages, like of the variants that were like, yeah, the 2.8, and then you showed some states were 4, some states were 7.
Yeah.
Is that as a percentage of variants or as a percentage of positive cases?
So that is a good point. So I think they mean the same thing. So I'm not sure what you're meaning is the distinction. So for instance, within region 7, they sample all of the cases. And so among the sample, this is the percentage of that variant among all of the ones that were screened, all the genomes that were screened. So it should represent the same proportion. Assuming that there's no bias in how they did the sampling, which is what we're assuming, then that means that this should represent the proportion of cases that have this variant in this region.
So I understand, sorry. So you're saying like when you term it the Wuhan one, that would be included in this, and it's so
Yes.
low now? It's mostly
Exactly.
the variants?
Exactly.
Oh,
Because that's what happens naturally is that this is the case with all viruses and bacteria. They evolve, it's survival of the fittest. They evolve to be more contagious over time, typically. Especially for a disease like this, where it's not a chronic infection, but it's an acute resolving infection within like 10 days for the majority of people, and within what was it, like I think 10 days for almost everyone, with some exceptions of immunocompromised and stuff. When the virus is going to die out in a person within that short amount of time, the only way it can create more offspring is to be more contagious. And so that means that the invisible hand of evolution is driving all of these things to be as contagious as possible. And so that means that the original variant was a low amount of how contagious it was, and the new variants are just getting more and more contagious. All right, Rebecca.
Okay, thank you, Mark, and Glenn, thank you for clarifying. Okay, so Glenn, we have a question. Folks are curious about side effects from the COVID vaccine, particularly side effects for kids. Can you tell us what is known about heart inflammation as a potential side effect from the COVID vaccine?
Yeah, so now that we're starting to give the mRNA vaccines to more people, particularly more kids over the age of 12, there is a possibility now, it's been identified, it's just being looked at, that male, so for some reason boys are more likely, well, not necessarily, it's still being investigated, but there's a possibility that boys under the age of 26 may be more likely to have heart inflammation, so what's called myocarditis. And so this is still being investigated. The problem is we don't know exactly how common this is in general, because if someone has heart inflammation that just lasts for a few days, it might give them symptoms that include shortness of breath, feelings of your heart fluttering or heart pounding, but in almost all cases, it's self-resolving, and a lot of kids wouldn't even know, they wouldn't pay attention to it. So for instance, there could be some examples where someone gets the flu, then these are some symptoms. But so we don't know exactly how common it is. And so as a result, we don't know if the vaccine's causing it, or whether after people get the vaccine, they're just more aware. And so any little thing that they might have, they might be reporting it. So we don't know if it's a reporting bias or if it's actually real. But because it's been reported, it's being looked into. It's still really, really, really rare. So around 1 out of every 5,000 males under the age of 26 who have gotten the mRNA vaccine have reported this symptom. And among the people who report this symptom, they're almost all mild and easily treated with anti-inflammatory medicines. So it's not something that's super concerning. So 1 in 5,000 is a really, really low risk. Obviously, everyone should continue getting the vaccine, even kids over the age of 12. And this is something, that's why there's no pause on this. It's still highly recommended, because myocarditis is not something that's unique to the vaccine. We do know that it's very common among people who have COVID-19. And so it's obvious it's less common in kids than in older folks, but it's still very common in kids, way more common in kids than the 1 in 5,000 that we're seeing here in the vaccine. So so the COVID-19 is so much more higher risk that everyone should get vaccinated. However, this is good to know that people who do get the vaccine, virtually all of them have gotten it within the first 1 to 5 days after they have gotten the vaccine is when they've gotten these symptoms. Any boy under the age of 26 who gets these symptoms should go to their emergency room or their doctor to just inform them about it and get it checked out. Because this is something for the vast majority of these people, it's mild and nothing to worry about. But for a portion, so they're 1 in the 5,000, it's mostly mild. But then among the 1 in 5,000, among that portion, a portion of those will be at risk so that they would need to go to the emergency room. It's a very small proportion, but it's a serious enough issue that you would want to tell a physician about it. So again, if any boy, this applies to anyone, but particularly this that has only been it's being investigated among the boys under the age of 26 right now. But basically, if the symptoms are chest pain, shortness of breath, or feelings of a fast beating, fluttering, or pounding heart. And so that's where we are with that.
All right, good to know. Thank you for taking us through that.
Sure.
All right, so as often has been the case over the past year and a half, there have been stories in the news, and you have helped us sort of dissect the stories in the news and take us through your interpretations of what you feel is sort of real and not real, and what we should take away from that. And what's been all over the news this week has been about Fauci's emails.
Yeah.
And so many of us are very curious what you think of Fauci's emails.
Yeah.
So take us through that, please.
Yeah, this is a good time to review what we know about the origins of this virus, how we know it, what's the sum of evidence. But basically, this is fake news, but let me go through it. So basically, the New York Post and a bunch of very inflammatory newspapers out there saw the email that Fauci had put out. And back in February of 2020, so this was before the lockdowns, before we knew what that a lot of the stuff was going on in the United States. It was, I think, slightly before it was going on in Europe. Fauci had emailed people and talking about, oh, is this something we need to be worried about? And it wasn't something we needed to be worried about, but I'll go into the details here about how we know what we know. And so the short answer is that we were not secretly funding any kind of gain of function research. But I'll get into that in a second of what that even means. We're doing this. Instead, let's take us back to the beginning. So we know that SARS-CoV-2, this COVID-19 virus, is not the first coronavirus pandemic that we've had. This is actually the 7th coronavirus pandemic. And this is the 3rd coronavirus pandemic in the last 20 years. The first one was SARS-CoV-1 virus, what people were just calling SARS was the disease, and that hit us in 2002. MERS hit, that was the Middle Eastern version, hit us, or a different species, but that was Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome. That hit in 2012. And so we were expecting, all the epidemiologists were expecting that because this was nothing new, the first one was 2002, then not the first one, the most recent one that I've talked previously about, those other 4 that hit us many decades or centuries ago, and now have just become the common cold because they're just so common. But the 2002 SARS freaked a lot of epidemiologists out, a lot of people in public health who were paying attention to this. And we realized that, and this was followed up by MERS in 2012, those 2 diseases are much more severe in terms of the health consequences than COVID-19 is. And so we were really worried. The infection fatality rate is quite a bit higher. The good thing is that they're not as contagious. there's two reasons why COVID-19 really spread more than those other two, than SARS or MERS. And that's because the COVID-19 virus, SARS-CoV-2, is more contagious than those were. And like even the original Wuhan variant was, and it has asymptomatic spread, whereas those other SARS and MERS were mostly symptomatic spread. Asymptomatic spread is really bad because it means a lot of people can infect other people without even knowing that they have the virus, because they have no symptoms at all. And so that's one of the reasons it spreads so easily. All right. So after SARS and MERS, and then I'll get into this in a second, but the top level response, we realized in the United States and around the world, but in particularly the United States, that we could not trust China because SARS was coming out of China, and we couldn't trust them because no one believed that it was a lab type of thing. It was just a natural phenomenon. And it's happened multiple times before, and we thought it would happen multiple times again. The issue that we had was that we couldn't trust that China would report to us because they were very secretive in terms of their news. And so we funded two major programs there. One program was to put a lot of epidemiologists' feet on the ground. And I think that was through the State Department that was funded, but it was in collaboration with the CDC, but it was through the State Department, where we had a lot of epidemiologists on the ground around China that were collaborating with China's own epidemiologists and really building these authentic relationships. So if any outbreak did occur, they could immediately sound the alarm, and the United States epidemiologists would already be there and could just jump in and help with what's going on. Where it was a collaboration, where it was really not an adversarial relationship, but a collaboration. The second thing that we had was the Eco Health Alliance, where they worked to survey, and this has been going on, I think, for almost 10 years or so, at least 5 years, and then it was renewed under Trump, but I think it was closer to 10, where the Eco Health Alliance was going out to bats around parts of China where the bats were occurring and sampling saliva, blood, and poop in all these bats. And they were finding out where the coronaviruses existed, what was the risk of the coronavirus, how many people might be infected with coronavirus annually, et cetera. So these two programs were so important. Unfortunately, Trump had his trade war with China. And as part of the trade war with China, Trump decided that it wasn't the United States' responsibility for our tax dollars to fund their public health infrastructure. And so Trump said he stopped the program with the epidemiologist on the ground. That was the one out of the State Department, and totally stopped that funding and had them all come back to the United States. And that funding stopped in the summer of 2019. So this outbreak occurred in October, November time period is when it first started happening in China. And we pulled our epidemiologist program, the whole program, out just a few months before that. It was really bad timing. It shouldn't have happened at all. But because we did that, it started this adversarial relationship with China. Then once this outbreak happened in April, so remember March, April 2020 is when we started having the lockdowns and it was really getting bad. In April, Trump realized we were still paying for the Eco Health Alliance. The Eco Health Alliance, again, was the one that was going around to all the bats, taking the sampling. They were working with the local viral institutes there, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and the Wuhan Institute of Virology's role. And we were, the amount of working we were doing with them was really minuscule. Basically, we were paying them $75,000 a year. That's nothing in medical research terms. It's enough for us to get the foot in the door so we could have these collaborative relationships where we had access to the samples, we had feet on the ground, we could go in and leave at our leisure. $75,000 was a really, really cost-efficient thing to do that. But as soon as Trump found out about this, he blamed China, he made it adversarial, and he immediately stopped the program without giving them any warning at all. He just said, that's it, we're cutting it off, no more. As soon as that happened, China blocked us. The lab would not allow us to have any more access to the samples. They wouldn't allow us to speak to the scientists anymore. It was adversarial as part of this trade war, and that was the end of any friendly relationship. So now we're kind of screwed because forget about SARS-CoV-2. This is bad as it is. But we all think there's going to be another pandemic happening. Give us another 5-10 years, there's going to be a SARS-CoV-3 or another coronavirus or some other epidemic. We need those feet on the ground. And now the Trump administration takes the blame for this. They get the blame that we don't have feet on the ground there anymore. And going forward, I don't know a way to correct this, because we need to get epidemiologists back on the ground there, and the ones studying the bats. So the problem is, and let me just spend a few more minutes on this, because it's just the evidence here is just so important and that we need to get into, just so people know it's not a perspective, it's just the evidence is so overwhelming. So first of all, let's talk about gain of function research. Sometimes when you look at viruses or pathogens in general, you might look at it and then want to make adjustments to it to see how bad it is, because in nature, there might be some variants that are existing, but maybe you don't have to be super concerned about it if it's very, very far away from the number of mutations it would take to get to something more concerning. So sometimes you might do do your own mutations in a very, very secure lab in order to infect other animals. So maybe monkeys or other types of things, in order to see if there was this gain of function where it could become more contagious with just a few mutations. Let me tell you something, for $75,000 a year, you're not getting any gain of function research paying. Who knows if it was going on outside of that, but it was unlikely related to this, and almost certainly not going on with the coronaviruses. And the reason we know it was not going on was because we were still at a pretty early stage. One thing that we found, and let me jump, so first of all, we know with the specific Wuhan variant that came out, that there was no evidence of any kind of weird mutations that have been put in. First, okay, that's the first thing. We've looked at this extensively. Labs across the world with lots of different motivations have been looking to see if there's any possibility that there was mutations that were put in that were not just part of the normal scheme of things. And what they found was that SARS-CoV-2, if this is like all the different variants, SARS-CoV-2 just fits in the middle. There's nothing unique about it. It's just another species, not a variant, rather, it's a species. These are all different species. SARS-CoV-2 is just one of many, many, many species that they found. In fact, let me tell you more specifically, they took 15,000 samples from bats. This was the EcoHealth Alliance. That's a lot of samples. They were looking and going to a lot of bats. They took 15,000 samples from bats. Of those, they found 400 completely new coronaviruses. That's a lot. It's scary. They found 400 new coronaviruses, and there are probably more that we didn't because we stopped the program before it was finished. In addition, we found 50 of those that were the SARS-CoV-1 and SARS-CoV-2 similarities. There were 350. There were other coronaviruses that don't even fit into the SARS-CoV-1, SARS-CoV-2 grouping. The other thing that we found, so that's the first thing, that there are 400. When you look at where SARS-CoV-2 fits within that, there's nothing abnormal. We've looked at this in lots of different ways. The research has been continuing. The most recent one was published in January 2021. It's continuing to be looked at. There is no, all of these are consistent. If there was any funny business going on, we would have found it because we couldn't do that. But the other most important thing is because we know so little about the coronavirus, we wouldn't even know what gain of function studies to do because we don't know what makes one more contagious than another. All of these variants are coming out, and we, like the Delta variant versus the Alpha variant, we don't know what's going to be more contagious until we see its behavior in the real world. We're just super ignorant. The global scientists are ignorant. We don't know this coronavirus. That's the whole reason we were doing these EcoHealth Alliance studies and these other studies there. The gain of function studies would have been something that comes later. We're nowhere near understanding the behavior of this virus. So that's the main reason we know. But let me dig into this a little. Some people are saying, well, what if it wasn't a newly created virus? Or what if it wasn't a gain of function virus, but it was just poor lab practices? And I think that is a possibility. But before I talk about that, let me jump up to another fact that's come out from the EcoHealth Alliance. What they found was that every year, these coronaviruses are so common that every single year, between 1 million and 7 million people are exposed in rural China and rural Southeast Asia to these coronaviruses. Millions of people every single year get infected with these, or at least exposed, but many, a large percentage of them infected with these coronaviruses. In addition, they found that there's multiple mini outbreaks that are occurring in these small rural towns that go undetected because they cause problems in the towns, but they never jump from the town to the bigger cities. And so because these are so common, for most epidemiologists, it just seems obvious. First, it seems obvious that SARS-CoV-2 just came from one of these, and it seems obvious that the next species is going to jump too. Give it another 5-10 years, and we're going to have another coronavirus jump. The problem is, what do we do now? If this was caused by a lab accident, then the obvious solution to prevent the next pandemic would be to focus on the labs, negotiate contracts with countries around the world to prevent lab accidents. That would be the focus if that were the main cause. If the main cause was from a natural cause, and like I said, this is the 7th coronavirus pandemic, the 3rd within the last 20 years, then that means that the major solution should be to address the natural infection, do anthropological studies to try to figure out what's the behavior of the people where they're getting infected, do vaccination studies and vaccination programs in these places, do really focus on the natural. My perspective is we need to do both. We can't just do one, but the natural is something we can't avoid. The question is, given that these viruses are so infectious, should we even do research on this at all? Was it bad for the EcoHealth Alliance to go and collect 15,000 samples from bats, given that the coronavirus could cause another pandemic? So most scientists would say there's no way around it. Given that SARS-CoV-1 hit us in 2002 and MERS hit us in 2012, we knew that this was going to hit us again repeatedly. It's just the way the world is now. We need the science to understand it. So that means there was no way to avoid this. I think Trump's point was that we shouldn't have been doing research like this at all. Now, it could be there are these two famous people in China. One's called the Bat Hunter. I can't pronounce his name. Probably it's Qian Zhenjua. And then the Bat Woman is Shi Zhengli. This is Shi Zhengli. She works at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and you can see her here in the nature with the bat flying around, and she's going to try to collect it. Then there's, I don't think I have a picture of the Bat Hunter. I think his affiliation was with the China CDC. And here's some pictures of what they do. In nature, they collect the bats. They try to have full protection. But when it's really hot and humid in some of these areas, maybe their protection isn't so good. So maybe some of them are infected. And so maybe this is a source. When they're collecting in the field, when they're collecting this, maybe one of these people got infected there. Also, they've taken the samples, they put them in the vials. Now the vials are infected. Once you take the vials back to the lab, maybe the Wuhan lab did have these vials, and someone in the lab got contagious. Lab accidents happen all the time. It's just a fact of life. And so now we basically have these 4 scenarios. And the 4 scenarios are this. It's possible that one person out of the millions who are infected every year happened to go to the city to sell their animals or whatever, for whatever reason. And Wuhan, one of the reasons that this Wuhan Virus Institute is there is because it's surrounded by a lot of rural areas, and it's a great place to study it because there's all the bats around there. I see that we're running over a little bit, but I'll end this soon. So that's one option, is that it just was natural. You'd expect there to be an outbreak in Wuhan because that's where all the rural communities go, because that's one of the closest towns and cities for them to go to. All right, that's the first option, which is what most epidemiologists think is the most obvious option. The second one is that during the process of collecting samples from the wild bats, a field researcher accidentally got infected and he brought it back. So that's this one, where a field researcher got infected. That's also a possibility. They do put themselves at increased risk, but it's still not very likely relative to the ones who are infected. The reason that that's the case is because of this idea of screening. These millions of people who get infected, and you have these mini outbreaks. Once you have a mini outbreak, it sort of screens so that the next person to get infected is more likely to have a species of the coronavirus that's more likely to be infectious. just because it's more likely to spread from one person to the next. Someone just touching a bat without any previous infection, the risk of it being a human infection that's going to be very infectious is much lower than if they caught it from another human. So people in general are much, much more dangerous than a wild animal in terms of the risk of natural infection. So that's why number 2 is not the most likely, just as a probability thing. Number 3, is it possible that the process of injecting the human cells? Oh, so that's one thing that they did. So in order to see how problematic each of these 400 coronaviruses were, they took human cells and infected them all. And this is what the Wuhan virus, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, that's why they were partnered, why we partnered with them. They took all the samples and then we're doing genetic sequencing on them, and we're trying to sequence, trying to infect human cells for each of these samples. And the reason was, if it infected a human cell, then we knew that that was a higher risk coronavirus. If it could not, if they took the samples and they tried to infect the other human cells and they couldn't do it, then it was a much lower risk because it was a bat coronavirus, but not a human coronavirus. It was low risk. So it could have been in the process of doing this that they accidentally infected someone there. This too is also a very, very low risk type of thing, because it is the majority of these coronaviruses, again, would have been bat only coronaviruses. They wouldn't have infected humans. The final thing is what the Trump conspiracy folks are saying now, is that the Wuhan Institute of Virology, for the low price of $75,000 a year, was doing cutting edge research on gain of function research, which doesn't make sense scientifically, because we're not at that stage yet of scientific understanding of this coronavirus to do the gain of function on those bat samples. But that no one knew about it, and for such a low amount of money, they suddenly sparked this epidemic. It's just really just thinking about it, and it's really extremely unlikely. It doesn't mean it's impossible. So let's keep on saying that. However, if you were to bet on something that happens 1 million times a year versus something that there's no evidence it's ever happened a year, it seems like the much more likely thing to bet on would be the thing that happens 1 million times a year. And so anyway, that's the big takeaway here. Trump, if we listen to the conspiracy theory, my worry is that we'll focus our attention on trying to prevent lab accidents, and we won't focus our attention on preventing the 1 million people a year from getting infected from these coronaviruses. And so we need to do both. Obviously, the risk of a lab accident happening is real. And so we need to ensure maybe that we have better precautions that are negotiated in formal treaties globally that are more severe than what we currently have, or stronger treaties than we currently have, to ensure that these are monitored and that there's safety precautions. But we need to look where the fire is, and the fire is at the natural source of infection, and we're nowhere near where we need to be to prevent these millions of people a year from being infected with that. So anyway, that's my perspective on it. This is where the sum of evidence is, and this is why right now it's really truly a conspiracy theory. There are no epidemiologists who you will find who are talking about this fourth option being the one that's really driving it, the gain of function.
All right. Thank you for breaking that down for us, Glenn. Very, very helpful. Let's wrap it up with a question from Mark regarding the severity of the variants versus the Wuhan virus.
Mark, right, sorry, real quick, sure. I could double dip. Just what's the latest on the severity of these variants versus the original one? I know they're more contagious. That's clear, but
so it's really hard to do this research. So we don't know. It's still so early, because the problem is the labs that are doing the genomic sequencing for the variants are different labs generally than are the ones like the hospitals looking at the cases and that kind of stuff. So typically the data is not flowing through. So it's hard to do this type of analysis. So we're seeing these rises in hospitalizations in some place, like we talked about Seychelles a few weeks ago, but we don't know exactly what variants are driving it, because it could be that you have more variants there, but it's not the one that's actually causing the severe disease. right now we know that the alpha variant has been more severe. It was around 50 to 60% more severe than the original one. We don't know yet about the Delta. There is some evidence coming out, excuse me, the Delta is slightly less severe than the Wuhan variant. But again, there's things that could be driving that don't tell us what we want to know. For instance, because the virus is so contagious, it could be that now that it's summer, the young kids are going out to, and they're 19, 20-year-olds are going to, I guess 20, 21, 22-year-olds are going to the bars and whatnot, and they're the ones mostly spreading it to each other. That might be where a lot of the spread is going on now. If that's the case, you'd expect it to be much less severe because it's all the 21, 22-year-olds who are spreading it. So right now, we don't have enough research to really probe into these questions to know, okay, if you adjust for comorbidities, adjust for age, adjust for all these things, apples to apples, which is more severe? We don't have good information on that right now. But at a high level right now, the early indications are coming in that Delta is less severe than Alpha. But again, my interpretation is it's too early to really interpret it because we don't, it could just be that it's 21-year-olds who are spreading it. So we can't interpret that. Of course, they're going to be less severe. So right now, we don't know.
Thank you.
Thank you for the great question, Mark. And I guess, Glenn, more to come as time unfolds and more details, unfolds in that area.
One more thing, Rebecca, to remind everyone. So we are now, because it's the summer, we're meeting every other week. So we're not going to meet next week, but in 2 weeks, we'll meet back again.
Okay. So June 20th, mark your calendars, everybody. We'll be meeting again, 7 p.m. Eastern time, June 20th. Yes? Sound good?
That's great. Sounds great. I always look forward to it. I love talking to everyone.
As do we. So keep the questions coming, everybody. Thank you to this amazing audience. We really, really appreciate these fantastic questions. As you can tell, Glenn puts in a lot of time preparing some really, really great research and answers to your questions. So please send them in. And of course, we thank you for your great questions during the program as well. And thank you for joining us live. Thank you for watching us on YouTube in between our sessions, and we look forward to seeing you on June 20th. Everybody be safe, be well, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Have a good night. Take care.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.